I said it with a laugh. "Lighten up, Nana. It's just a joke." As if that made it acceptable. As if my living room turned inside out, my hardwood floors sticky with spilled drinks, the sharp chemical scent wafting from the guest bedroom, and 6 near strangers passed out on my furniture was somehow humorous. At 77, I've witnessed enough life not to be easily shocked. But I was entirely unprepared for this brand of disrespect in my own home. And I certainly wasn't ready for the heavy, insistent knocking that echoed through the house at 2 in the morning. It began with a low, rhythmic thumping. I thought it was a dream, a phantom pulse from a forgotten memory. Then came the laughter, shrill, unrestrained, the kind that belongs to the young and feels entitled to all space it occupies. I sat up in bed, my heart doing a fragile tap dance against my ribs, and fumbled for my glasses on the nightstand. 2 realities clicked into place at once. The bass vibrating through the floorboards was real, and I was not alone in my house. I pulled on my robe, the familiar terry cloth feeling like a pathetic suit of armor, and descended the stairs. I already knew who I would find. Chloe, my 19-year-old granddaughter, adrift and perpetually figuring things out. She'd appeared on my doorstep 2 weeks prior with a single suitcase and a story about toxic roommates. I should have said no. But when your own flesh and blood stands before you, eyes wide with manufactured tears, you don't think. You open the door, you fluff the pillows in the guest room, you make a pot of tea. That is what grandmothers do. Only now, the guest room door was ajar, and the air that spilled out carried a sweet, acrid smell that was nothing like food. I didn't venture inside. I turned the corner into the living room, and there they were. Chloe was draped over my good velvet armchair, a red plastic cup in her hand, a boy's leather jacket thrown over her legs. A young man with vibrant blue hair was swaying to the music by the window. 2 girls were huddled on the rug, giggling at a phone screen. The evidence was everywhere. Bottles on the side tables, a trail of chip crumbs on the carpet, and my mother's crystal vase lying on its side, a crack running through its delicate surface. Chloe spotted me and waved a languid hand, as if I were a minor character in her personal movie who had wandered on set too early. "Nana, you're awake. We were trying to keep it down." "Turn it off," I said. My voice was a thin wire in the thick air. "Chill," she smiled, standing up and swaying on her feet. "It's just a joke, Nana. We're celebrating." I don't know what angered me more, the word joke or the way she said Nana, like it was the title for a harmless mascot. "This is my home," I said, my voice gaining a shred of strength. Chloe rolled her eyes, a dramatic practice gesture. "You told me I could have a couple of friends over." "A couple of friends." I gestured toward the kitchen where a person I had never seen was asleep on the linoleum, boots still on. "You said 2 people. It's past midnight." "That's not a crime," she retorted, her smile turning brittle. "I didn't say it was. I said it's my house." And that's when the knocking started. Not a doorbell, but 3 firm, authoritative raps that silenced the music and froze the laughter in its tracks. Everyone in the room went still. Chloe's eyes widened, the bravado melting into panic. She looked from me to the door and back. "I swear, if you called the cops," she hissed. "I didn't call anyone," I stated flatly. "But perhaps a neighbor had." From the front window, I saw the telltale flash of blue and red light painting the street in stark, urgent colors. Chloe cursed, a sharp, ugly word, and stumbled toward the entrance. "Don't say a word," she snapped over my shoulder at me. "Let me handle this." I remained rooted to the spot, a spectator in my own downfall. I watched her open the door and attempt a charming, lopsided smile. Officers! Hi! I couldn't hear their initial questions, but I saw their expressions. One was young, his face unlined but serious. The other was older, with the wary eyes of a man who had seen every flavor of human folly. Both of them stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Whose residence is this?" the older officer asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Chloe gestured vaguely in my direction. "My grandmother's." The officer's eyes found me. "Ma'am, can we speak with you?" Chloe turned, her expression a desperate plea. "Nana, they just want to ask you something. Be cool, okay?" I stepped forward, my slippers whispering against the ruined floor. "They are my granddaughter's guests," I said, choosing the word carefully. "They were not invited by me." Chloe's head whipped around, her face a mask of betrayal. "Nana!" The younger officer nodded. "We've had a noise complaint. Neighbors also reported concerns about possible illicit substances. Do you know anything about that?" I looked at the strangers, the mess, the cracked heirloom, and Chloe standing there as if I was the one who had broken the rules. I was asleep until 30 minutes ago. I was unaware of any of this. The older officer addressed me directly, his tone kinder now. "Ma'am, if these individuals were not invited by you, and you are the legal resident, you have the right to have them removed. We can facilitate that." I should have said no. I should have woven a protective lie, as I had so many times before. When she'd borrowed my car and returned it with a dent. When cash had gone missing from my wallet. When her father, my son, had assured me she was just going through a phase. But I didn't. I looked at the broken crystal, at the stranger sleeping in my kitchen, at the chemical smell that promised deeper trouble. I looked at Chloe, and for the first time, I did not see the little girl who used to help me plant marigolds. I saw a user, comfortable in her exploitation. "You may proceed," I said. And in that moment, I did not feel weak or cruel. I felt a terrifying, crystalline clarity. The officers asked everyone to sit. One of the girls started to protest, talking about her rights, but the younger officer, whose badge read Davies, was firm. "No one is under arrest yet, but you're not free to leave." The word arrest did something to Chloe. I saw her shoulders hunch, her bravado completely desert her. She sank onto the couch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, chewing on her lip like a chastened child. They began taking statements, names, ages, addresses. I watched from the archway to the dining room, a silent sentinel. Officer Davies eventually approached me. "Ma'am, are you okay to answer a few questions?" I nodded and led him to the kitchen table. I pulled out a chair, its wood smooth and familiar under my hand. Just hours ago, I had sat here shelling peas, the world still in its rightful order. "Can you confirm how many people your granddaughter invited over tonight?" "She told me 2. This," I gestured around us, "was not agreed upon." "Has she exhibited this kind of behavior before? Pushed boundaries?" I hesitated. The ghost of 100 minor transgressions flitted through my mind. The missed curfews, the borrowed jewelry, the sullen silences. "There have been incidents, but never to this scale." "Were you aware of any substances in the house? Alcohol, marijuana, anything else?" I shook my head. "Not until I came downstairs tonight." Officer Davies made a note. "You're not in any trouble, ma'am, but depending on what we find, we may need to bring your granddaughter in for further questioning." My stomach clenched. Even now, a primal, maternal instinct screamed to protect her. But that part of me was being forcibly, painfully shrunk, replaced by something harder and more resolute. In the living room, the older officer, Matthews, was examining a small black backpack they'd retrieved from behind the sofa. From my vantage point, I could see that it contained several small, clear plastic bags. I didn't need to ask what was inside. Chloe saw it too. "That's not mine," she blurted out, her voice shrill. "I don't know whose that is." Officer Matthews was impassive. "This was directly behind the couch you've been occupying all evening." "I didn't put it there." One of the girls on the floor, a skinny thing with a face full of freckles, spoke up softly. "I saw her with it earlier." "You're lying!" Chloe lunged, but Officer Davies was there, catching her arm in a firm but non-violent grip. "That's enough," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "All of you are going to be taken to the station for statements. If there's nothing to charge you with, you'll be released." "But I live here!" Chloe cried, turning to me with wild, pleading eyes. "Nana, tell them I live here." I met her gaze, my own steady. "You are staying here," I corrected, my voice quiet but absolute. "You do not live here, and I did not give you permission for any of this." The words landed with the force of physical blows. She blinked, stunned, as if the floor had just disappeared from beneath her. "You're really going to do this to me?" she whispered, the question hanging in the chemically tainted air. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said 1,000 times in softer, more forgiving ways. That I was exhausted, that I could no longer be the architect of her excuses, that enabling someone is just a slower, more intimate form of destruction. They lined the young people up in the foyer. Officer Davies stayed behind for a moment, pressing a business card in my hand. "If you need to make a formal statement later, or if there are any repercussions, call this number." He paused, his eyes holding mine. "You did the right thing, ma'am." I merely nodded, unable to form words of thanks. I stood in the sudden, ringing silence as the door closed, taking the chaos and my granddaughter with it. The quiet that remained was the most profound I had ever heard, and it was filled with the echoes of every time I had looked the other way, every "she's just young," every "she'll grow out of it," every "she doesn't mean it." I went upstairs, changed out of my robe, and put on an old, comfortable sweater. Then I came back down and began to clean. I opened the windows to the cold night air, bagged the bottles and trash, and wiped down the sticky surfaces. I worked methodically, mechanically, as if by scrubbing away the physical remnants of the night, I could somehow purify the space it had occupied in my soul. At 3:15 a.m., the phone rang, an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again at 3:20. I picked up. "Nana?" Chloe's voice was thick with tears. "They're not charging me yet. They said I could be released in a few hours. Can you come get me?" I said nothing. "Breeze," she whispered, the sound a desperate crackle down the line. I didn't know that stuff was in the bag. You know I'd never—" "I'm tired, Chloe," I said, cutting her off. My voice was devoid of emotion. "Just talk to them. Tell them the truth." Then I hung up. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the small desk in the hallway, to the drawer where I kept stamps and stationery, and where, 2 weeks ago, I had tucked a folded $100 bill just in case she needed anything. I pulled the envelope out. The money was still inside. I held it for a moment, then tore it in half, and then again, and again, until it was confetti, a meaningless shower of paper that fluttered into the kitchen trash. By 4:30 a.m., the house was clean. The stain on the rug remained, a dark, stubborn blotch, but the rest was in order. I made a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and stared into the quiet hallway. Then I took out my notebook, the one I used for grocery lists and gardening reminders, and on a fresh blank page, I wrote the date, and beneath it, a single, stark sentence. Tonight, I finally stopped making excuses. The silence the next morning was a different creature. It wasn't the stunned quiet of the night before, but a heavy, waiting stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath to see if I would break. I did not. I moved through my routine with a numb, deliberate rhythm. Shower, dress, boil water for tea. The familiar actions were an anchor in a sea of emotional chaos. The phone rang at 9:42 a.m., a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, then immediately played the message, my hand trembling slightly. This is Officer Matthews from the Somerset Police Department, calling on behalf of Miss Chloe Evans. She's been released and requires transportation. If you could contact us or arrange to pick her up within the hour, we'd appreciate it. I sat down heavily in my armchair. The script was laid out before me, clear as day. I would drive to the station. She would emerge, red-eyed and contrite, her voice small. I didn't mean for it to go so far, Nana. I didn't know. We would drive home in a thick silence, and by evening, the unspoken agreement would reset. Her music would thump from behind her bedroom door. My name would only be called when she needed something. This was the well-rehearsed dance of our relationship, and I had always led by following. This time, I did not call back. At 10:26, a different number flashed on the screen. Then, at 10:51, it was my son, Robert. The last time he'd called was months ago to ask if I could cover a sudden car repair bill he couldn't mention to his wife. "Mom," he began, his voice a low, tense wire. "What the hell is going on?" "Good morning, Robert," I said, my tone flat. "She said she spent the night in jail." "She spent the night at the police station," I corrected. "There's a difference." "What happened? She said you called the cops on her." "No, the neighbors did. I simply declined to lie for her." A beat of furious silence. "She's 19, Mom. For God's sakes, you couldn't handle this another way? She said she asked for your help." "She did, and I said no." Unbelievable. I could hear him breathing, a sharp, angry sound. "Robert," I said, forcing a calm I did not feel, "did you know she was throwing raucous parties in my home?" "What? No, of course not. She said she had a couple of friends over." "She had a house full of strangers, drunk, loud, and there were drugs, Robert. The police found a bag." Another pause, this one shifting in quality. "She said it wasn't hers." "Maybe it wasn't. But she lied. Again. And this time, I am not pretending it's a minor character flaw." His voice turned to ice. "You could have ruined her future over this." A dry, mirthless sound escaped me. "I didn't ruin anything. I've been cleaning up her messes for years. What I didn't do, for the first time, was make myself smaller to protect someone who shows me no respect." "That's not fair," he snapped. "No," I agreed, my voice quiet and final. "It's not. None of it has been." He hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like an angry insect. I placed the receiver back in its cradle, my hand steady. The shaking had stopped. It was as if his anger had burned away the last of my uncertainty. By noon, the texts began, from Chloe. "Nana, I'm sorry. Please let me come back. I have nowhere to go. You don't care if I end up on the street, do you?" I put the phone on silent. The painful truth was, I did care. I cared so deeply, it felt like a chronic illness. But caring had become a chain, and every time I'd yanked on it to guide, to warn, to love, she had only learned to pull harder, dragging me through the dirt of her poor choices. I was tired of eating mud. I made a simple lunch and ate it at the table, not standing over the sink. The quiet was no longer oppressive, it was a blanket. Around 2 o'clock, a resolve, cold and hard, settled in my core. I went to the hall closet and retrieved the fireproof lockbox from the highest shelf. Inside were the documents of my life, the deed to the house, my will, bank statements, a list of beneficiaries. The will was 6 years old. Back then, Chloe was a bright-eyed high school graduate, and Robert still visited for Sunday dinners. Back then, I still believed we were a family. I read through every page. 3 hours later, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. "Eleanor," I said when she answered, "it's Irene. I need to make an appointment to revise my estate planning. Completely." Then I called my bank. "Hello, this is Irene Bell. I'd like to set up a meeting to review all account authorizations. And I want to create a new account. In my name only. No co-signers." The young woman on the line was polite. "Of course, Mrs. Bell. Would you like us to close the existing joint accounts?" "Eventually," I said, my voice firm. "But for now, I want to ensure no one can access any of my assets without my explicit, documented approval. I'll be in Monday morning to sign the necessary papers." I hung up, the finality of the action echoing in the quiet room. I placed the documents back in the box, and for the first time since Chloe had arrived, I turned the deadbolt on my front door from the inside. The solid thunk was a period at the end of a very long, run-on sentence. I expected a confrontation that evening. Tears, shouting, a dramatic scene on the porch. It didn't come. Instead, just after 6 p.m., the doorbell rang again. This time it was 2 short, impatient bursts. I knew that rhythm. Robert. When I opened the door, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman in a severe black blazer, her hair pulled into a tight bun, a leather-bound clipboard held against her chest. "Mom," Robert said, his jaw tight, "this is Ms. Albright. She's a family mediator. We need to talk." I looked from his strained face to the woman's professionally neutral one. "Come in, then," I said, stepping aside. They settled on my sofa. I remained standing, a subtle reclaiming of territory. Ms. Albright offered a calibrated smile. "Mrs. Bell, thank you for your time. I understand there's been some familial discord recently." I wouldn't call a drug raid discord. I'd call it a crisis. Robert sighed, the sound dripping with exasperation. "Mom, we're not here to fight." "Then what are you here for?" Ms. Albright leaned forward slightly. "Your granddaughter is very distressed. She feels she's been left without a safe place to stay, and that there's been a significant communication breakdown. We're hoping to facilitate a resolution." "She threw a party with drugs in my home," I stated, the words clear and unadorned. "She maintains she was unaware of the illicit substances," Ms. Albright countered smoothly. "From her perspective, you overreacted, publicly humiliated her, and made her vulnerable to serious legal consequences." Robert cut in. "She could have been charged, Mom. A record would follow her forever." "And she could have overdosed," I fired back, my voice rising for the first time. "Or one of her friends could have. Or I could have lost my home. Do you understand that? This isn't about hurt feelings, Robert. This is about real, tangible danger." He looked away, toward the window. Ms. Albright made a note on her pad. "I am not evicting her in a legal sense, but I will not allow her to return here at this time. My home is not a rehabilitation center or a nightclub." "So where's she supposed to go?" Robert demanded, turning back to me, his eyes flashing. "Isn't that your concern?" I asked. "You are her father." He flushed. "I work, Mom. I travel. We don't have the space." "I see. You had space when I paid her private school tuition. You had space when I covered her first month's rent after she dropped out of community college. You had space when you needed my help, but not now." The silence was thick enough to slice. Ms. Albright cleared her throat. "Mrs. Bell, have you considered a structured, mediated family dialogue? It can often help clear the air." I've spent years structuring the silence, I said, looking directly at her. That's how I kept the peace. It seems all I was doing was storing up conflict. Robert stood abruptly. I didn't come here to be insulted. No, I said, walking to the front door and opening it wide. You came here hoping I'd go soft, that I'd fold, as I always have, that I'd absorb the consequences so you wouldn't have to. That ends now. I looked at Ms. Albright. If Chloe wishes to write me a letter, a real one, taking responsibility for her actions and their impact, I will read it. But this delegation of guilt, no more. They left, Ms. Albright with a tight, professional nod, Robert without a backward glance. I locked the door, the bolt sliding home with a definitive click. Then I sat in my armchair, the worn fabric of familiar comfort, and watched the evening sky deepen from blue to indigo. The battle lines had been drawn, not in anger, but in weary, long overdue self-defense. Later that night, I saw a flicker of movement outside. I stepped quietly to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. A figure in a dark hoodie was crouched by my porch, fumbling with something near the base of my potted fern. I rapped sharply on the glass. The figure, one of the boys from the party, jerked upright and sprinted off into the darkness. When I opened the door, I found what he'd left, a small, sleek black vape pen, half hidden in the soil. I retrieved it with a napkin, placed it in a clear plastic bag, and wrote a note for myself. Found on porch, 10:37 p.m., belongs to one of the party attendees. I left it by the door. If they were going to try to drag me back into their chaos, I would be ready, with evidence. The next morning, I found my porch steps dusted with cigarette ash. I sweep those steps every single evening. This was a message. Not a plea, but a petty act of defiance. I didn't call the police, not yet. I simply fetched my broom and dustpan, swept the ash away, and dumped it in the outside bin. The rhythm of my life was changing, becoming less about reaction and more about quiet, firm action. The call came at 10:02 a.m., another unknown number. This time, I answered. Hey! It was Chloe. Her voice was flat, drained of all its performative energy. So I guess this is how it is now, she said. Chloe, you know I did not plant drugs in my own house. Then who did? She shot back with a spark of the old defiance. That is a question you should be asking your friends, not me. She was silent for a moment. I'm staying with Kyle, she muttered finally. Kyle. A name I knew. A boy with sullen eyes and a reputation. Are you safe? I asked, the question automatic, maternal. She let out a short, bitter laugh. What do you care? I asked a question. I don't know, Nana, probably not. But that's kind of the point, right? You want me to suffer a little. I closed my eyes, leaning against the cool kitchen counter for support. I want you to feel the consequences of your actions, for once. I want you to understand that choices have weight. Silence again, longer this time. You're saying you're changing your will? She said, her tone shifting. You're seriously cutting us off? I didn't answer. She laughed again, a hollow sound. You know, I thought you were different. I thought you were the one person who'd never give up on me. The words were meant to wound, but they only confirmed my decision. I was that one person, Chloe, until I realized I wasn't helping you. I was erasing myself so you could keep pretending there were no rules. Whatever, she snapped, the connection fraying. You think this makes you strong, leaving your own granddaughter to fend for herself? You are not on the street, Chloe. You are with Kyle. You have a phone, you have options. You are 19, Chloe, not 9. The line went dead. I held the phone for a moment longer, then placed it gently back in its cradle. I didn't cry. Instead, I went to my desk and pulled out the drawer where I kept mementos from her childhood. A clumsy clay handprint, a glitter glue card, a school photo with a gap-toothed smile. I didn't throw them away. I placed them carefully in a small cardboard box, sealed it with tape, and wrote, Chloe, The early years, on the side. Not as an act of rejection, but as an act of preservation, to remember that there was once a version of her and a version of me that knew how to love without this terrible, exhausting cost. The lawyer's office smelled of lemon polish and old paper, a scent that seemed to embody the gravity of permanent decisions. Eleanor, my attorney for 30 years, sat across from me, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed the documents I'd drafted. "Irene," she said, looking up at me over the rims, "these are significant changes. You're removing Robert as your executor and power of attorney. You're making Chloe's inheritance conditional upon her maintaining steady employment and sobriety for 5 consecutive years with verification. And you're naming a local women's shelter as a secondary beneficiary." "I am," I said, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The navy blue dress I wore felt like a uniform for this final, formal act of reclamation. Eleanor studied me, her gaze sharp, but not unkind. "You're sure about this? There's no ambiguity here." "The ambiguity is what got me here, Eleanor. A lifetime of maybe and someday, and she doesn't really mean it. I'm done with ambiguity." She gave a slow, deliberate nod and slid the papers back to me. "Then sign. We'll have it witnessed and notarized right now." The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. Each signature felt like laying down a stone on a new path, one that led away from the swamp of obligation I'd been stuck in for years. When it was done, I felt neither triumphant nor vengeful, just clean, as if I had finally scrubbed away a layer of grime I hadn't even known was there. The following Monday, I met with Clara Jensen at the bank. The same plastic ferns stood sentinel in the corners, the same soulless instrumental music whispered from hidden speakers. Clara, ever professional, didn't flinch when I stated my purpose. "I want to close the joint account with my son, Robert Bell," I said, my voice clear in the hushed space. "I want to revoke any and all authorizations he has on my other accounts, and I want to confirm that I am the sole signatory on everything." "Of course, Mrs. Bell," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She pulled up the records. "I see a recurring automatic transfer to a mortgage account for the last 4 years. And a smaller monthly withdrawal for a Chloe Evans for the past 19 months. Canceled them both, effective immediately. Consider it done." She printed out a stack of papers for me to sign. "And the joint account? Close it. Transfer the full balance to my personal savings." With each signature, I felt lighter. I was not just moving money, I was moving boundaries. I was rewriting the unspoken contract that said my resources were a family utility, available on demand without question or gratitude. When I walked out of the bank, the autumn sun felt warmer on my face. I stopped at the small park near my house and sat on a bench watching squirrels chase each other up an oak tree. A young mother pushed a stroller past me, humming to herself. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel a pang of bittersweet nostalgia or a crushing sense of loss. I felt a quiet, steady sense of my own presence. I was here, I was whole, and I was accountable only to myself. This new clarity did not make me hard. It made me discerning. When Marlene from 2 doors down stopped by with a loaf of zucchini bread and gentle questions, I didn't unburden myself. I simply thanked her and changed the subject to her prize-winning roses. When the phone rang with unknown numbers, I let it go to voicemail. The world continued to turn, and I learned that I could observe its spin without being caught in its whirlwind. A week after the bank, a plain white envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper. Chloe's handwriting, but different. Less sloppy, more deliberate. "Nana, I got the papers from the lawyer. I understand why you did it. I would have been furious a year ago, but now I get it. I wasn't safe to trust. I want to be that person again, someone you can believe in. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. And in its stark, simple honesty, it held more power than 1,000 tearful "I'm sorries" ever could. I didn't frame it or throw it away. I placed it in the small wooden box on my dresser, alongside my late husband's watch and my own mother's locket. It was a piece of history, a marker of a shift. The seasons turned with a quiet finality. The vibrant reds and golds of October gave way to the bare, honest bones of the trees in November. I took up small, tangible projects. I repainted the garden shed a cheerful sky blue. I sorted through decades of accumulated belongings, donating bags of unused items to the thrift shop. With every object I let go, I felt I was making more room for myself in my own life. One crisp afternoon, I was on a stepladder, cleaning the gutters, a task I'd always waited for a man to do, when a voice called out from below. "Need a hand with that, Irene?" It was Frank, a widower who lived 3 houses down. We'd exchanged pleasantries for years, but never much more. "I think I've got it, Frank, but thank you," I said, surprised by the easy confidence in my own voice. He smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed expression. "Stubborn. I like that." He tipped his hat and continued on his walk. I finished the gutters, my muscles aching in that good, honest way that comes from a job well done. As I was putting the ladder away, I saw a figure standing at the end of my walkway. Chloe. She wasn't carrying a backpack or a suitcase. She just stood there, hands shoved into the pockets of a simple wool coat, watching me. I closed the garage door and walked toward her. Not rushing, not hesitating. "Hi," she said. Her face was free of the heavy makeup she usually wore, and she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Hello, Chloe." I got a job at the bookstore downtown, the one you always liked." I nodded. "That's good news." "Yeah, it's just part-time, shelving and working the register, but the manager said I'm reliable." She shifted her weight. "I'm staying with a friend from work now. Her mom knows I'm there. It's stable." "I'm glad to hear that." We stood in a silence that was no longer charged with anger, but with a fragile, newfound respect. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she said again, echoing her letter. I wanted you to see that I'm trying." "I see you." And for the first time, I felt that I truly did. I saw not the ghost of the perfect granddaughter I'd wanted, nor the monster of the one who had betrayed me, but a flawed, struggling young woman who was, against the odds, trying to find her footing. She nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and I saw her eyes glisten. "Okay, well, I should go. You can stay for a cup of tea if you'd like." The offer hung in the cool air between us. She looked at me, then at the house, then back at me. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. "I'd like that," she said. I led the way inside. The house was warm, smelling of the apple cinnamon candle I had burning. I put the kettle on, and she sat at the kitchen table, the same one where the police officer had taken my statement months before. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about her job, about the books she was discovering, about the novel I was reading for my book club. It was stilted at first, then easier. The conversation was a bridge, and we were both testing its strength, careful not to put too much weight on it at all at once. When she left, she didn't ask for a key. She didn't ask to come back. She just said, "Thank you for the tea, Nana." "You're welcome, Chloe." I watched her walk down the path, her posture straighter than I remembered. She didn't look back. I closed the door and leaned against it, the solid wood firm against my back. The house was quiet, but the silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of absence or punishment. It was the silence of peace. It was the quiet of a storm that has finally passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and the chance for new growth. I had gone to war not with my family, but for myself. And in laying down the weapons of endless compromise and self-sacrifice, I had not destroyed my relationships. I had, perhaps, given them a chance to be rebuilt on a foundation of truth and mutual respect rather than on the shifting sands of guilt and obligation. It was not a perfect happy ending, but it was a real one. And for a woman of 77 years old, that was more than enough. It was everything. The first frost came, silvering the lawn and etching delicate patterns on my window panes. I watched it from my sunroom, a cup of hot tea warming my hands. The sharp, clean air of late autumn felt like a baptism. Inside, the quiet of my home was no longer a void to be filled, but a presence to be cherished. It was the sound of my own soul, finally given space to breathe. Chloe's Sunday visits became a tentative ritual. She never called ahead, and I never waited for her. It was an unspoken agreement that held a new kind of respect. Sometimes she would bring a scone from the bakery near her work. Once she brought a book she thought I'd like. We talked about small things, the new display window at the bookstore, the stubborn rose bush in my garden, a documentary she'd seen. We were learning a new language, one without demands or accusations, and the grammar was slow and careful. One Sunday, she arrived with her hands shoved deep in her pockets, her shoulders hunched against the cold. "The heat's out in my apartment building," she said, her breath making little clouds in the air. "The super says it might be a few days. Would it be okay if I did a load of laundry here?" It was a simple request, but it felt monumental. She wasn't assuming, she was asking. "Of course," I said, and led her to the basement. While the washer churned, we sat at the kitchen table. The familiar hum filled the comfortable silence. She looked around, her gaze lingering on the small changes I'd made, the new tea kettle, the stack of library books on the counter. "It feels different in here," she said softly. "It does," I agreed. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't need her to. The difference was me. I was different. Robert called occasionally. The conversations were short, polite, and strangely formal. He'd ask if I needed anything, and I'd tell him no. He'd update me on his work, and I'd listen. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The umbilical cord of financial and emotional dependency had been cut, and we were both learning to stand on our own. A novel experience for a man in his 50s, and a revelation for his mother. He never mentioned the changed will or the closed bank accounts again. The silence on those topics was his form of acknowledgement. One afternoon, I was in the hardware store, buying a new washer for a leaky faucet, another task I'd once waited for someone else to handle, when I saw him. He was at the end of the aisle, looking at power tools. Our eyes met. He offered a small, hesitant wave. I nodded back. We didn't approach each other. It was enough. We had seen each other, not as roles to be played, but as people, separate and whole. As winter's grip tightened, I found a new kind of contentment in the solitude. I took a poetry class at the community center. I started a quilt, something I hadn't done since I was a young woman. The slow, deliberate stitches were a meditation. One evening, I was working on it in the lamplight, a classical music station playing softly, when the doorbell rang. It was Chloe. She held up a paper bag. "I made soup. It's vegetarian. I thought you might like some." I ushered her in from the cold. She ladled the soup into 2 bowls at the stove, her movements confident in my kitchen for the first time without an air of entitlement. We ate at the table. It was a simple lentil soup, but it was delicious. "This is very good," I said. A genuine, unguarded smile spread across her face. "Thanks, Nana." After she left, I sat for a long time in the quiet living room. The quilt lay half-finished on my lap. I thought about the journey from that night of chaos and chemical smells to this evening of quiet soup and conversation. The path had been painful, littered with the shards of broken expectations, but it had led here, to this peace. The holidays arrived. For the first time in decades, I did not host. I did not spend weeks baking and decorating and wrapping. Robert invited me to his house for Christmas dinner. I accepted. Walking in, I felt a flicker of the old anxiety, but the feeling passed. I was a guest. I brought a pie I had baked because I wanted to, not because it was expected. The dinner was stilted at first, the new dynamics awkward. But Chloe was there, helping her father in the kitchen, and she served the food with a quiet pride that was new. We talked about neutral topics, the weather, a movie, the pie. It wasn't the warm, familial fantasy I had once clung to, but it was real. It was a beginning. As I was leaving, Robert walked me to my car. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp pinpricks in the black velvet sky. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said, his hands in his pockets. "Thank you for having me." He hesitated. "The soup Chloe made, she said you liked it." "I did, very much." He nodded, looking up at the stars. She's doing better, I think." "I think so, too." He looked at me then, and in the dim light I saw not my little boy, not my demanding son, but a man, weary and trying. I'm glad you're well, Mom." "I'm glad you're well, too, Robert." It was the closest we would come to an apology, and it was enough. I drove home through the silent, festive streets. My house was dark when I arrived. I turned on the lights, one by one, illuminating the spaces that were wholly, completely mine. I made a cup of tea and sat in my armchair, the finished quilt now draped over its back. I had thought the story was about a lawsuit, about betrayal, about drawing a line in the sand. But I was wrong. The real story was about what grew in the quiet after the storm. It was about the slow, stubborn resilience of love when it is finally freed from the prison of obligation. It was about learning that the greatest strength is not in holding on, but in having the courage to let go, and the wisdom to know what deserves to be let back in. The phone did not ring. No one knocked on the door. The silence was a gift I gave myself, and I opened it, slowly, savoring every precious moment. Spring arrived not with a fanfare, but with a quiet insistence. The first brave crocuses pushed through the cold earth at the edge of my garden, their purple and gold heads a defiant declaration against the gray of winter. I watched them from my kitchen window, a sense of parallel unfolding happening deep within my own spirit. Chloe's visits had settled into a comfortable rhythm. She came most Sundays, sometimes with a new book for me, sometimes just with her presence. We had graduated from tea at the kitchen table to tackling small projects together. One sunny Saturday, we repotted the overgrown spider plant that had languished in the same container for a decade. Our hands, one young and smooth, the other lined and speckled with age, worked in the rich, dark soil. We didn't speak much, but the silence was companionable, filled with the simple, shared purpose of nurturing life. I'm thinking of taking a class, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of a muddy wrist. The community college has a course on small business management. The bookstore manager said it would be a good idea. I felt a surge of pride, so sharp it brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I kept my head down, focusing on the plant. That sounds like an excellent idea, I managed, my voice slightly thick. I'd have to pay for it myself, she continued, her tone pragmatic, not pleading, but I've been saving. Then you will appreciate it all the more, I said, and I knew she heard the approval in my voice. This was the real inheritance I could give her now. Not money, but belief. It was a currency I had never been able to spend before, buried as it was under a mountain of resentment and enabling. My own life continued to expand in gentle ways. I joined a weekly walking group with other women from the community center. Our conversations meandered like the paths we took, through topics of gardening, books, the charming follies of our pets, and the complex, often unspoken landscapes of our families. I found I could listen to their stories of wayward children and strained relationships without feeling the old, familiar pang of personal failure. I was just a woman walking with other women, sharing the burden of being human. One afternoon, I returned from a walk to find a package on my porch. It was a rectangular, flat box wrapped in simple brown paper. There was no card. Inside was a beautiful, hand-thrown ceramic platter, glazed in a deep oceanic blue. It was sturdy, elegant, and utterly my taste. I knew, with a certainty that required no evidence, that it was from Robert. It was not an apology wrapped in grand gestures. It was an offering, a quiet signal that he saw me. Not as a function, the mother, but as a person with her own home, deserving of beauty. I placed the platter on my dining table, where it caught the afternoon light. I didn't call to thank him. Some gifts are best acknowledged by their quiet, daily use. It became a part of the landscape of my home, a solid, beautiful reminder that healing does not always need words. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a rainy Tuesday. I was at the bookstore where Chloe worked, browsing the new fiction section. I saw her at the counter, helping an elderly man find a specific mystery novel. She was patient, listening carefully, her manner kind and competent. She didn't see me. I watched as she walked the man to the correct shelf, found the book, and chatted with him for a moment. This was not the performative, charming girl from the past. This was a young woman building a life, brick by humble brick. As I was leaving, I picked out a book on the history of quilting and brought it to the counter. She looked up, and a genuine smile lit her face. "Nana, I didn't know you were here." "I was just browsing. This looks interesting." I handed her the book. She rang it up, and as she handed me the bag, our fingers brushed. "I got into the class," she said, her voice low but buzzing with excitement. "It starts next month." "Oh, Chloe, that's wonderful." This time I let her see the full, unguarded pride in my eyes. She beamed. "Thanks. For everything." I knew what she meant. She wasn't thanking me for the roof I had provided or the money I had given. She was thanking me for the tough love, for the no that had been the most difficult yes of my life, a yes to my own worth, which had ultimately given her the space to find her own. I walked home in the soft rain, the book tucked under my arm. The world was washed in shades of gray and green, clean and new. The story of the lawsuit, the betrayal, the painful separation was not the end of our family's narrative. It was the brutal, necessary turning point. The old, fragile structure, built on obligation and silence, had to collapse so something sturdier and more honest could be built in its place. That evening, I lit a fire in the hearth, a rare, indulgent treat. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it from the blue platter. I thought of the women in my walking group, of Frank's friendly wave, of Chloe's confident posture behind the counter, of Robert's silent gift. I was not at the center of their worlds, and they were not at the center of mine. We were separate planets, each in our own orbit, but the gravity of our care for one another was a real and steady force. I picked up the quilt I had finished, its patches a mosaic of my life, scraps from a dress I'd worn in my 20s, a piece of an old tablecloth, a swatch from one of Chloe's childhood blankets. It was not perfect. The stitches were uneven in places, but it was warm and it was whole. It was a testament to the act of taking fragments and piecing them together into something new, something functional and beautiful in its own unique way. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. I pulled the quilt around my shoulders and sat, watching the flames dance. There was no dramatic conclusion, no sweeping musical score. There was just this: a quiet house, a warm quilt, a peaceful heart. The story was not over. It was simply continuing, page by quiet page, in a language of slow healing and quiet grace. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I was content to simply read it as it unfolded.